Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On today's episode, I'm talking to Khoi Vinh. Khoi is currently principal designer at Adobe and writes frequently on his blog, subtraction.com. He previously worked at Wildcard, co-founded Mixel, and was the design director for the New York Times website. Back in August, I visited Khoi at the Adobe offices in New York City, and we talk about how he started blogging and how Subtraction has helped his career in design practice. We also talked about the value of design criticism and the need for a richer discourse around digital design, looking at other fields like architecture and film for inspiration and connecting it to history and looking at kind of a wider cultural context. Khoi's blog, Subtraction, was one of the first blogs I started reading when I got into design 12 years ago. So this was a fun episode that really covers a lot of topics in a short amount of time and brings a sort of different perspective to design writing, especially around digital product design. That is a subject that we don't really get to talk about a lot on this podcast. So it was a true pleasure to get to talk to Khoi and hear his perspective on these things. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Khoi Vinh. As I was just telling you, I kind of came to design, and blogs were this kind of like fundamental piece in my design education, and Subtraction was one of like the very earliest blogs that I read, and so I thought that would be a kind of good place to start of kind of why you started that site and kind of what were you thinking at the time, where were you in your career, what kind of outlet was that?
Sure. Well, I had registered the domain a long time ago, in like 1996 or something.
Oh, wow.
20 years ago. I can't
Wow.
believe it. And I was even at that time, I was surprised that it was available.
Yeah.
And that was well before blogs. So for a few years, I used it as a portfolio site or a place to just throw up like ideas that I thought were interesting or to play with design. There was a period there where for personal websites were really kind of like a personal gallery space.
Yeah.
And then when blogging software came along, I was like, oh, this is a great way to post regularly, to a tool to make it easier to publish online. And then that sort of led me into, writing more and more. I mean, I tried to write briefly, but I just found myself writing more and more. And I've always been a writer. I've always been, interested in writing. And all of a sudden, I found that I had this platform to do it.
Right. That was something I wanted to ask, is if you had done much writing before kind of blogging came along, or how that...
Well, I went to art school to study, painting, illustration, and eventually design. And I had always sort of been on a trajectory like this one, but there was a moment in time when I was at school when I thought maybe what I'll do is write instead, because I really enjoyed writing. And I still do really enjoy writing. So, I mean, the reason I started blogging was blogging software made it possible, but more to the point, it allowed me to do something that I enjoy.
Yeah. And were you thinking about like writing about design and the things that you were working on kind of very early, or where did that kind of, it was a natural outlet, it was how you were spending your days, of course you were right about it, or kind of where did that originate?
Well, in the very beginning, I was just posting links to things that I found interesting online, like everybody did.
Yeah.
And they were the links that I selected or curated were naturally design oriented.
Right. Okay.
And from there, it seemed natural to comment on them. And then from adding commentary, it just seemed natural to explore ideas in somewhat greater depth.
Yeah. Do you, I think it's interesting that there are not many people that have kind of kept up that consistent kind of writing practice like you have.
Mm-hmm.
How how does that kind of fit into what you kind of do as your job, or like how do you make time for that? Why do you make time?
That's a great question. I mean, there are a few reasons why I continue to do it. You know, the simplest to understand reason is it's been a great asset to my career. Like, it's been a great way to become known and to meet other people and to understand ideas about design better, like the process of writing and essentially engaging in a conversation with readership really helps me understand. It's a great way to communicate with an audience and build an audience. And at another level, I write because I just genuinely enjoy writing and enjoy the process of figuring out my ideas.
Yeah.
Now, it's really hard to continue writing and do it alongside having a job and a family and other projects. So one of the things I realized a long time ago is that, I mean, we're calling it writing, but blogging is not really writing. It's not really the same as writing anyway, at least the way I do it. It's like there's a certain superficiality to the way I write, as much as I try to make, you know, the longer pieces that I write like really thoughtful and substantive. You know, I will rarely ever be able to put more than, you know, 60 or 90 minutes into a post, and that's just not enough time to really write.
That was something I wanted to ask, is if do you kind of write and do you like sit on them and edit them to make sure, or do you like, you have a list of things you want to write about, you sit down, you write one, it's posted? It's
not really, the way I write is not really stream of consciousness.
Okay.
And it's not really like a properly edited, you know, like heavily versioned.
Yeah. So somewhere.
It's somewhere on that spectrum, but probably closer to a stream of consciousness.
Okay.
So I will rarely like make a bunch of notes and draft an outline and sit down and
interesting.
And write quote unquote properly.
Yeah.
A lot of times most of the time the process is I get an idea for a post, I'll turn it over in my head for sometimes a few hours, sometimes a few days, sometimes a few weeks or months even. And I'll kind of like rehearse like key lines in my head.
Okay, yeah.
And then when either I've gotten to a point where I kind of have a good idea of what I'm going to say, or it's time to write a blog post, I don't have anything else to write, and I was like, oh yeah, I was thinking about this the other day, and I'll just start writing it down, and I more or less start at the top and finish at the bottom.
Oh wow.
And then at the end of that quote unquote first draft, I will start a process of rereading everything and making edits and copying and pasting and moving things around.
Yeah.
And I'll do that. It's hard to say how many times, but I'll probably do that like a half a dozen times.
Oh, interesting.
And then and then sometimes I will then leave it and then like go to a meeting.
Yeah.
Knowing that, it's the principle of walking away from your work and then coming back with relatively fresh eyes. That's
interesting. So do you write? That's interesting on a couple different levels. One, it's actually similar to kind of how I feel like the writing that I do is where I'll sit with it for a while, and I found that I cannot sit down and actually type it out until I know what the first sentence is going to be. I know the kind of rhythm of that sentence. I know how I want to start it, and then from there I can do it. But I have to sit with it for a while.
Yeah, that's not dissimilar for me. Like sometimes I know what I'm going to write about, and maybe I'll know some key points that will show up later in the post. But I get stuck on that first sentence, and I'll spend the majority of the writing time trying to hammer out that maybe the first one or two sentences.
Yeah. You know. Do you write every day?
No, I mean some days I will try to get by with just what's essentially like a glorified like link.
Okay, yeah.
This is a cool thing, and it's interesting because of this or that. And I'll try to make that as substantial as I can, but it's really about like continuing to sort of feed this machine or this beast, so that I don't totally lose my audience by the time I'm ready to write something.
Right. How? Let me think how to phrase this. How has that kind of process and that habit of writing, has that had any influence on your work as a designer, or like how you even think about design and your design process?
Yeah, it certainly has. It's less the act of writing that has influenced my process, and more like the actual ideas that I entertain while I write. So
Okay.
yeah, it's not really about because I'm a blogger then I write in this way or I design in this way.
Right.
It's more about because I'm a blogger, I've been exposed to certain ideas, and because of those ideas, then
Interesting.
I design in a certain way.
I'm curious how social media has changed how you think about. This is going to set up a couple other questions
Sure.
after, but I think it's interesting that you make a distinction between writing and blogging, and so I'm curious then kind of how social media and things like Twitter and that kind of like instant publishing, how has that changed blogging, and then specifically kind of the way you approach what you write on Subtraction versus what is just a link on Twitter?
I think there are a lot of threads in that question.
I know. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, I mean, social media has definitely changed blogging because blogging came along before social media, and a lot of what people were trying to do with blogging became redundant when social media came out.
Right.
So, I mean, if you're asking how social media has changed the way I blog, it's definitely changed the way I blog. I mean, sometimes I blog in order to sustain the audience.
Okay.
And sometimes I blog like purely because that's what I want to write about.
Right.
So it's actually, I kind of have this schizophrenic relationship with social media because sometimes like my stated goal for continuing to blog is just to have a place that I can write. At the same time, I also I benefit from the audience, and so like I need to sustain the audience.
Right.
And some days I'm like, well, nobody's gonna be interested in this, but I just want to write it, so I'm just gonna write it.
Yeah.
And then some days I'm like, well, I gotta find something that people are gonna want to read.
Right. I mean, it's interesting too because I was actually thinking about it when I was on my way over here of how diverse your subjects can be, and just like in this last week, you like wrote essentially a review of like a Wi-Fi system, and then Jason Bourne with the same type of like interest in both of them, which I think is kind of cool, and I feel like not many people do that anymore.
I think people anymore. I think is key. I think people used to a blog used to be like your Facebook page where you just throw up the stuff that you like.
Yeah.
And I kind of still really like that idea where it's a social it's a social space, but it's also a personal space. It's sort of like a teenager's room. It's like all the random stuff you like. It's like it's like a sports team and like a poster from like a gallery show or something. So, I
want to talk a little bit about design criticism. You've written a couple posts recently kind of about that. The two that I'm thinking of are the one kind of related to the Met redesign and needing kind of a more critical discourse around that. And then your other one, which I thought was really interesting, was kind of questions to ask yourself when you're reading about design. And I'm interested in kind of how you think about quote unquote design criticism and the need for it in the profession.
Well, I think that the state of design criticism sort of reflects the sort of like junior varsity status of design as an art form in culture. Meaning,
Right.
there's no, you know, there's very little serious, thoughtful analysis, writing, and coverage of what we think of as graphic design or product design or what have you.
Yeah.
Almost all of it is written by people who do design or practitioners as well.
Right.
And as a result, that stuff is inherently compromised.
Yeah.
And that's what the post about like questions to ask yourself when reading like anything about design is. And I don't think I think within the design community there's very little like sort of critical appraisal of what gets published on Medium, particularly.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say there's almost like a stereotypical Medium post from kind of the Silicon Valley product designer that kind of masquerades as criticism a little bit, but it's also here's this thing that we worked on.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's definitely a trope on Medium, and there's probably only a few kinds of design articles that are written really today. There's like an article about like how to do something.
Right.
Like here are the tips and tricks. There's an article about like here's the way designers can work better in an organization or managing designers. I don't know. There might be a third one that I can't think of at the moment, but there aren't many.
Yeah. Do you think this writing that type of kind of critical writing that you're talking about do you want that for kind of the design profession for designers to be talking about this stuff, or are you thinking about this as for the audience of these products? Like, is there a need in the people who use a product or to encounter a design to kind of understand criticism of it?
I think for both, I think they're of the same piece. I think if the profession isn't talking about design in a serious way, like nobody else will take.
Yeah.
And currently, most of what gets written about design it's not serious. I mean, of course, it's serious in that it's trying to take into account real world circumstances and being serious about its charge, which is to help businesses succeed.
Right.
But it's not serious in that, like, what does this mean in the larger picture for what we do, how we do it, why we do it, and also for the people who consume it. Like, like what does it mean to be in this world now where everything is quite reductive and looks very similar, and it's being pushed out like into a kind of a monoculture all over the world. Like, so I mean, that's stuff that we never think about or talk about, and it's not the kind of stuff that people generally are attracted to, like in the if you're talking in terms of traffic and clicks.
It's interesting too, because I think kind of one of the like sub goals of what I hope for this project is to kind of figure out new kind of deeper ways to talk about design for designers, but with the hope that then kind of permeates out to the users and the audience, because this has come up in a bunch of the interviews that I've done, that there's more people talking about design than ever, but not at a depth, which I think is interesting, and I think a lot of that is from social media and from that kind of like quick reaction. And so I'm in your piece about the Met, you kind of talked about this idea of like, and you just touched on it now, this kind of like the designer who's also the critic. How do you see that relationship, and is that kind of possible to, because in your piece you talked about like how is it self-serving to the designer, but then also how do you critique your colleague, essentially colleagues or social friends, because this is a kind of small community. Like how I don't know, that's a lot of questions, but
I think it's, I mean, the fact that designers are writing, I think, is great, and I don't think that's something that shouldn't happen. But the idea that that the discourse is completely, participation in discourse completely comes from people who are making money off of doing design.
Right.
Just means that the conversation is going to be inherently constrained to a certain range of possible expressions.
Yeah.
Or it's just completely compromised.
Right. So, that's interesting.
So I definitely think designers should keep writing and keep being sort of publicly thoughtful about their work. But if you talk about an institution like the Met, which is really important to a lot of people, regardless of whether or not they acknowledge it or even are aware of it, like if you were to change the architecture of the building, that would have serious ramifications for the way people experience the contents of the building or the mission of the organization. If you change up the logo or the branding or the way the organization communicates to its public and to the world, that has ramifications too.
Right.
But if you look at the way that logo, the reception, I mean, I'm not talking about whether people liked it or hated it. I'm just talking about like the level at which they debated it. It just wasn't satisfying and it wasn't really big picture.
Yeah. Do you think that kind of like critical discourse around design is possible? And I know that sounds like a very kind of pessimistic view. I do think that it is, but I don't know kind of how to get there.
I do think it's possible, and part of it, needs to come. I mean, I think a few things need to happen. I think designers, like the current design discourse, is very insular.
Yeah,
it's like all about like technique.
Yeah.
Or like managerial or like operational things. Design has traditionally done a poor job of communicating its relevance. I mean, a lot of times, like designers are talking to designers,
right,
or people who are already keyed into design. So I think design needs to focus a lot on being more relevant, like and being less invisible. Like,
oh, interesting. Yeah.
Like when an app gets redesigned, like when Facebook changes something, there are people are interested in it, but like the design, the discussion never really fully expands upon like why that's important to people and like what the bigger trends are and like what are the tools or the building blocks that are that the designers are working with to make these kinds of changes. And the model is architecture, right?
Right.
Architecture, there's serious thought and study, but there's a focus too on like explaining like why this stuff matters to people.
Right.
And the other thing that needs to happen is like we just need to have a platform or a publication that takes it seriously, that takes a leap of faith and says, okay, like there's enough people out there who are exposed to this stuff and think, we think that it matters, and we need to entertain the idea that this discussion will be valuable to people.
Right.
And you have a few people like Steve Heller. You mentioned you talked to him. Like he's got a column at the Atlantic, and he writes about this kind of stuff, and that's great. But it's just not enough people, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I talked to Alexandra Lang, who's an architecture critic and has written, New Yorker, New York Times, and I talked to her a little bit about how historically there have been architecture critics at these major publications, and even that's kind of
Yeah.
harder to do, and just the economics of criticism is so fraught
Yeah,
right now.
that's true. Yeah.
Which just kind
Any
of
kind
like
of criticism.
yeah makes it kind of so much more interesting.
Yeah.
I just want to kind of wrap up with a few kind of quick questions. I think it's interesting that your job now is primarily in the digital space, and I'm wondering if the way you think about kind of criticism of strictly digital design or product design, what's lacking there? Are there kind of topics or issues that kind of need to be talked about in these kind of like more emerging fields of design that just
Yeah.
haven't been discussed?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in a lot of ways, people talk about product design as if it just appeared out of thin air and there were like no historical precedents. And so, I mean, when you critique a new operating system design or even like a new app design, like the frame of reference only goes back about 18 months.
Right, right,
You know?
right.
So history is a huge thing. Like a focus on the users and not just like their the user flow, but
Right.
also like what the impact is on their life. Like, when you say like people can't use this new feature, like what does that really mean to their quality of life, or like the way they think about the world in general? Like we get something like this thinking when products get really enormous and at great scale, like Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah.
But another thing is like sometimes like less glamorous products have big impact too, a big influence, and we never get to talk about that.
Yeah. I just you saying that even made me think about the like a couple years ago the flat versus skeuomorphic kind of discussion, and I don't know, that frustrated me in a lot of ways because it felt very just kind of superficial and wasn't actually talking about kind of the underlying issues about why apps should look a certain way, and then how that influences kind of how you interact with them.
Yeah.
And like maybe I'm not kind of looking in the right place, but I still feel like there's not really a kind of discussion about, like you were saying, like user flows and actual interaction models and
like flat versus skeuomorphic, I think was a perfect example. I mean, people talked about it primarily as like a moment in time when a certain kind of aesthetic change was happening. But if you looked over like the bigger picture, it's like it was really, there are a lot of really interesting ideas there. One of them, which is like, we've been on a progression where our screens were getting higher and higher resolution, more and more color, more and more pixels, and with each leap forward in sort of fidelity, our operating systems got more baroque and more detailed and more elaborate, until we got to a point where like iOS 7 or a little bit later like material design, whatever came along, and all of a sudden, even though you had all this resolution, all of a sudden things got simpler than ever before. And it's sort of like, to me, that's really interesting. That's sort of like some kind of interesting inflection point in the way we think about aesthetics and computing together. But that's not really what people talked about at all.
Right.
They talked about usability, they talked about like user flow and this and that.
I hadn't thought about it. There is an interesting gap there where it was kind of like the designers were talking about the kind of aesthetics of it, and then like the tech writers and The Verge and things like that were talking about kind of like the technical aspects of it. But there is that kind of gap, which is interesting.
I mean, talking about like user flow and usability and performance, I mean, I see that a lot in product design as like the stand-in for like true substance. I mean, it's like that is what stands in for real relevance.
And
it's relevant. It's important for sure. I mean, that's a large part of talking about architecture. It's like, can people move through this building and get to what they want? But there's also it's not the full picture at all. I mean, there's a lot of other things to consider.
That makes me think of like another question that might be kind of a hard question to answer, and I don't even know if I like have it fully formed, but I'm thinking about how you would critique or write about with substance an app, like very holistically, and putting it in kind of like a historical context
Yeah.
and kind of the visuals, but also kind of like the user flow. How would you even begin, or how would someone begin to kind of look at that
Um,
type of
yeah.
interface holistically? Is it something?
Well, I mean, I think a few things. You would need to have the time to sit down and write about
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
You would need to be in a position where you could write freely without compromising your
right,
income. But
right, yeah,
you would sit and think about you know like Snapchat, like who are these users? I mean, not just demographically, but like what is the essence of what they do? It's like this idea, this temporal idea,
yeah,
or I mean, this idea of like sharing temporally, or security, or privacy, or whatever. And what does it say,
right,
about like their character, or where we are in the arc of like
yeah,
society,
yeah,
not just social, and then how does that manifest itself in the interface, and in like the design of it, and like what does it say,
yeah,
like the way, like I'm a big movie fan, obviously, and sometimes
yeah,
like you can look at a movie, and you can see that it tells it, regardless of what the story tells you, it also has like a particular sort of like
yeah, yeah, yeah,
flavor or view on the world, right?
right,
That's might be cynical, or it might be really optimistic, or it might be really conflicted, or
yeah, yeah,
whatever the adjective is, and that's what you would try to draw out of an app, and
yeah.
really understand like what it's what's really motivating it, like at a deeper level.
It's interesting. I hadn't made that connection before. I talked to Rob Giampietro, who's running material design now, and I was saying how I was kind of telling him how I thought material design was this interesting kind of almost like creating a specific kind of design culture.
Yeah.
And he was saying kind of how important it is to look at this stuff in the larger cultural context, because these apps are creating a culture of their own, but they're also emerging
Yeah.
in a wider culture, and how those things kind of interact with each other
I totally agree. Yeah.
is interesting. I hadn't kind of fully connected all that until you were just kind of saying that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just kind of last question to wrap it up. Just kind of bring it back to subtraction. What do you have any kind of like? This is going to sound such like a formal question, but do you have like goals or ambitions with your writing, or is this kind of purely just you love to do it?
Well, I just came back from vacation. We were in Europe for almost a month, and I
Oh,
didn't.
nice.
I think I posted like once or twice from
Yeah,
there, and I felt, I well, on this break from blogging, I was like, wow, it's really nice not to have to think about blogging.
yeah,
Maybe I'll just stop.
really.
Yeah,
Like that was a thought that you had.
yeah. It's like maybe I'll just stop. And then I got back, and then I sat down at my desk. It's like, oh well, there's just a couple of things I want to say, and I just sort of, I guess it's almost compulsive. I just started doing it again.
Yeah,
Like, and even when I was entertaining the idea of stopping, it's like, well, I mean, I knew that I would always want some kind of place just to put something
yeah,
online, and I have never been satisfied with the idea of putting it on like somebody else's site.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
I guess I come from this, or I have this hang up about like wanting to control the
yeah,
space, and
yeah,
present it in the way that
yeah.
I want to present it.
I think I may have actually gotten this quote from you, the John Gruber quote of like wanting to own every pixel on his site, which is
Yeah,
why he like doesn't have comments or anything like that, or
yeah,
he's like
right.
it's not on Medium. Like he wants
Yeah,
to control all of
yeah.
that.
I don't think that was for me, but that's a
Yeah,
good summary of like my
yeah.
approach. Yeah.
Just kind of to wrap it up now. Do you consider subtraction a kind of forum for design criticism? Like, do you think of what you do as criticism?
I don't know. It's a tricky question. It's certainly not like, it's certainly not the level of criticism that I think needs to be out there.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't hold up what I do as,
Yeah, and I didn't
you
mean to
know,
ask that question to like
oh,
set up. I didn't want that to sound like you were talking about this kind of criticism, and then to make it sound like you were saying that you are achieving that.
I mean,
do you aspire? I guess, do you aspire for yourself to that kind of level of discourse and writing that you want to see? Do you have any ambition to do that?
Yeah, I certainly. I mean, given the time, mostly, I certainly would be able to to write like what I sort of picture in my head as being like the right kind of criticism. Like I often look at apps and say, oh, I could sit down and like write something really interesting about this. Like, you know, there would be like 1,000, 2,000 words or something.
Yeah.
But it takes a lot of effort, but it also takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. But also really just takes like devoting yourself to this craft, because it's a muscle that you have to build up. And like I haven't really like built up that muscle beyond a certain like level, beyond certain like my level of serious criticism is more like an enthusiast level than like a true like critics level, I would say. Yeah.
Well, I think I appreciate. I think you're selling yourself a little bit short. I think there is like an enthusiasm, but I think there is more of a depth than is found in a lot of other places. And I think with as many kind of projects that you're doing and having a family and a job and all these other side things, the fact that you've sustained subtraction regularly for this long is an accomplishment. And I know I've gotten a lot from it, like in my design education. So I appreciate you kind of chatting with me here and for kind of your writing.
Thanks. Actually, I genuinely appreciate that, because like a lot of times I just sort of feel like, what am I actually doing this for?
Yeah. I've talked to a couple people who have said, I do this writing, but I don't know if anyone actually reads it. And I don't know how much value it has. So this is a very common thing. But I appreciate it, and thank you very much.
Sure.
And I thought this was great. Thanks for talking.
It was really, really fun, actually.
This episode was recorded on August 5th, 2016 in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.